Under the December skies of 2000, Fayetteville, North Carolina, carried the pulse of the Army base that defined it. Fort Bragg was everywhere, its culture, its soldiers, its families. To live there was to live under the shadow of duty, of long days, and of the constant reminder that service came before everything else. Captain Marty Thea, at 31 years old, was one of those men whose life was shaped entirely by that sense of duty. He wasn't flamboyant, he wasn't boastful. Instead, he was the kind of man who moved through life with quiet reliability. Friends and colleagues described him as grounded, steady, someone you could trust not just in uniform, but also as a human being. He had built his life on the pillars of discipline and responsibility. He was a man who loved his work, loved his country, and wanted to build a stable home life alongside it. Marty had grown up in Ohio, raised in a family that believed in hard work, in education, and in sticking to your word. He wasn't the boy who caused trouble in school. He wasn't the kind of teenager who chased after popularity. Instead, he was serious-minded, even thoughtful, and he carried that seriousness into adulthood. When he chose the Air Force as his career, it wasn't just about job security. It was about having a purpose. He liked order, he liked structure, and he thrived in an environment where rules weren't suggestions, but necessities. And yet, beneath that uniform, Marty was more than just a soldier. He had warmth. He was the kind of person who remembered your birthday, who showed up when you needed help moving furniture, who lent an ear when you were down. People close to him often said Marty had a gift for listening. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush to judge, but instead let people pour their hearts out. It was that quiet steadiness, that patience, that had first drawn Michelle into his orbit. Michelle was different from Marty in almost every way. She was strikingly beautiful, with a personality that was vibrant, outgoing, and magnetic. Where Marty was reserved, Michelle was expressive. Where Marty tended to plan his steps carefully, Michelle liked to leap before she looked. She had grown up in Florida, raised in a more chaotic environment, and she had learned early on how to draw attention. To men, she was captivating. To women, sometimes intimidating. She had charm, but it was the kind of charm that could also be manipulative. When Michelle and Marty first met, they seemed like a perfect balance. She brought sparkle into his life, while he provided the stability she had always lacked. To Michelle, marrying an officer like Marty felt like winning a safe future. She liked the respectability it gave her, the image of being an officer's wife. To Marty, marrying Michelle felt like stepping into a world brighter than the one he was used to. He loved her energy, her beauty, her ability to fill a room with laughter. He thought he had found a partner who would walk through life with him, supporting his career while building their home together. By the late 1990s, they had moved to Fayetteville to be close to Fort Bragg. Marty's Air Force duties consumed his time. Long hours, training sessions, constant responsibility. Michelle tried to build a life of her own in that small southern city. She dabbled in psychology and counseling, exploring jobs that suited her intelligence and her interest in people, but nothing ever stuck. She grew restless easily, and the routine of being a military spouse began to wear on her. Life in Fayetteville had its own challenges. It was a community built around soldiers and their families, where loyalty and image mattered. Women often found themselves alone for long stretches when their husbands were deployed or buried in work. Some leaned on one another, forming close-knit support groups. Others looked for distractions. For Michelle, distraction came in a new form: the internet. This was the early 2000s, when the online world was still in its infancy. Chat rooms and message boards had begun to flourish, offering a kind of anonymity that was intoxicating. For Michelle, it was an escape. Behind the glow of a computer screen, she could be whoever she wanted to be. She wasn't just the wife of a serious, hard-working officer. Online, she could present herself as mysterious, desirable, misunderstood. She could play the role of a woman trapped in a passionless marriage, longing for attention, for excitement, and men on the other end of the screen responded. What began as casual conversations soon became more. Michelle thrived on the attention. Each flirty message, each expression of sympathy from strangers, fed something inside her. She had always wanted more than what her life gave her. More thrill, more passion, more validation. And while Marty thought she was occupied with small jobs or local friends, she was slipping deeper into this digital double life. Marty noticed changes in her, though at first he didn't recognize what they meant. She seemed more distracted, less affectionate, sometimes distant in conversations. But Marty, ever devoted, chalked it up to the strain of military life. He believed marriage meant weathering difficult seasons, and he trusted that with time, things would balance out. He still loved her. He still believed in their vows. He was willing to work harder if it meant keeping their marriage strong. Michelle, however, was already drifting beyond the point of no return. Her dissatisfaction with Marty wasn't just about his long hours or his reserved nature. She began to feel that the stability she had once craved now suffocated her. Marty's predictability, his sense of duty, the very traits that had once attracted her, now seemed boring. She wanted more than quiet dinners and military schedules. She wanted danger, excitement, passion, and she was willing to look outside her marriage to find it. It was during this restless period that Michelle's world began to collide with men in the real world, not just through the screen. In Fayetteville, surrounded by soldiers and officers, temptation wasn't far away. And when she eventually crossed paths with a man named John Diamond, a decorated Army Ranger, she found exactly the kind of intensity she had been craving. Marty, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the storm forming around him. He was focused on his career, on serving his country, and on being the dependable husband he believed Michelle wanted. He had no idea that his wife was not only dissatisfied, but actively creating a life outside of their marriage, a life that would eventually put him in mortal danger. As 1999 gave way to 2000, the cracks in their marriage were no longer subtle. Friends noticed Michelle's growing independence, her flirtations, her tendency to complain about Marty when he wasn't around. Marty's friends, however, rarely heard him speak ill of her. To him, Michelle was still his wife, the woman he had promised to love. He didn't see himself as a victim. He saw himself as a man working through the challenges of married life. But while he carried the weight of loyalty, Michelle carried the weight of secrecy. That secrecy was about to unravel. Michelle's restlessness wasn't just leading her toward infidelity, it was leading her down a path so dark that it would eventually shatter not just her marriage, but lives around her. For Marty, the man who had devoted himself to service and family, the most dangerous threat wasn't from an enemy overseas. It was waiting at home, behind the smile of the woman he trusted the most. By the year 2000, Michelle Thier's marriage to Marty was hanging by threads Marty couldn't even see. To the outside world, they still looked like a respectable military couple. Him in uniform, her well-dressed, smiling at social gatherings, but inside their home, they were two people living very different lives. Marty poured himself into his Air Force duties, traveling when he needed to, meeting expectations, being the steady man he had always been. Michelle, though, had already drifted into a secret world, a world filled with lies, temptation, and a man who would ultimately become her weapon. That man was John Diamond, an Army Ranger stationed at Fort Bragg. Where Marty was calm and restrained, John was fiery, intense, and reckless. He had the sort of physical presence that drew attention, a muscular build, a soldier's sharpness, and a confidence that sometimes bordered on arrogance. Women noticed him, and he knew it. And when Michelle crossed paths with him, something dangerous sparked immediately. The first time they met, Michelle was electric, flirtatious, letting her charm shine brighter than usual. For John, it was an easy seduction. Here was a beautiful woman, married but unsatisfied, telling him stories of neglect and loneliness. He listened, but unlike Marty's quiet patience, John offered excitement. He showered her with compliments, with passion, with the kind of physicality that Michelle claimed her marriage lacked. What began as casual encounters quickly turned into a full-blown affair, and Michelle was intoxicated by the thrill. Affairs aren't uncommon in military towns. Long deployments, lonely spouses, and the constant churn of life on base can create temptations. But this wasn't just a fling. Michelle wasn't looking for something temporary. She was searching for an entirely different life. And in John Diamond, she thought she had found her ticket out. But there was a complication. Marty himself. He was loyal, dependable, and despite the cracks in their marriage, he was never cruel or abusive. He didn't mistreat her. He simply wasn't the thrill Michelle craved. In her mind, though, Marty became the obstacle to her happiness. She didn't want to divorce him. Divorce would mean losing financial stability, respectability, and the image of being an officer's wife. She wanted freedom and excitement without the consequences. And so she began weaving a web that turned John Diamond from a lover into a weapon. Michelle's manipulation was subtle at first. In their conversations, she painted Marty as the villain, the man who kept her trapped, who didn't understand her, who neglected her. To John, who was already protective and possessive, this narrative hit hard. He began to see Marty not just as his lover's husband, but as a problem to be solved. The affair burned hot. They met in secret, sometimes in hotels, sometimes in parked cars, stealing moments like teenagers, though both were adults with lives and responsibilities. Michelle encouraged John's obsession with her. She told him things that made him feel like her knight in shining armor, the one man who truly understood her. John wasn't just her lover, he was her rescuer, at least in the story she spun. Over time, the whispers of dissatisfaction turned darker. Michelle began to talk about how different her life would be if Marty weren't around. She never framed it as murder outright, not at first. She phrased it in vague terms. How free she would be, how much happier she would feel, how John and she could be together without obstacles. But the implication grew clearer the longer they talked. She dangled the possibility of a shared life, of passion without secrets, if only Marty wasn't in the picture. John, for all his bravado, was vulnerable to Michelle's manipulation. He was addicted to her attention, her beauty, her promises. He believed that she truly loved him, that their connection was deeper than anything else in her life. He started to think about Marty not as a fellow soldier's husband, but as the wall keeping him from the woman he desired. Meanwhile, Marty noticed little of what was happening. He continued to trust Michelle, continued to focus on his duties. To him, she was still his wife, even if their marriage had lost some spark. He didn't see betrayal. He didn't imagine his wife plotting against him. He simply thought they were going through a difficult season. His loyalty blinded him to the truth, that his wife was orchestrating his downfall with precision. Michelle was careful. She never left clear evidence, never spoke too plainly. But she knew how to push John's buttons. She told him how trapped she felt. She played the role of the damsel in distress, the woman who needed saving. And John, trained to be a protector, a fighter, a man of action, fell into the role she created for him. He didn't just love her, he believed it was his job to free her. As the year 2000 unfolded, their plan took shape. Michelle would lure Marty into a vulnerable position, and John would be waiting. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was planned, deliberate, and cold. Michelle knew Marty's routines, his habits, his schedule. She knew exactly how to place him where she wanted him. The night of December 17th, 2000, was chosen carefully. Michelle convinced Marty to come with her to her office in Fayetteville. It wasn't unusual. She framed it as a quick errand, something that required his help. Marty, always supportive, agreed. He had no reason to suspect that the woman he trusted most was leading him directly into an ambush. Waiting outside, hidden in the shadows, was John Diamond. He wasn't dressed as a soldier that night. He wasn't following orders from superiors. He was following orders from Michelle, the woman he believed he loved, the woman who had convinced him that killing Marty was the path to their future together. That night would change everything. For Marty, it would be the end of a life built on loyalty. For Michelle, it would be the point of no return. And for John, it would be the moment where passion crossed the line into murder. The stage was set, the players were in place, and all that was left was for Michelle to walk Marty into the trap. On the evening of December 17th, 2000, the streets of Fayetteville were cold and quiet, the kind of winter night when the city seemed to settle early. Marty Thayer, dressed neatly as always, drove with his wife Michelle. She had convinced him to stop by her office that night, an errand that didn't make much sense to him, but didn't raise any alarms either. Marty had always trusted Michelle, always believed her explanations. In his mind, he was simply helping his wife, the woman he still loved despite the distance that had grown between them. What Marty didn't know was that the entire night had been scripted by Michelle. Her office wasn't just a workplace anymore, it was the perfect setting for an ambush, and waiting outside, in the shadows near the stairwell, was John Diamond. The Army Ranger had been primed for this moment for weeks, convinced that eliminating Marty was the only way he and Michelle could have a future together. He wasn't acting as a soldier on duty, but as a man consumed by obsession, holding a weapon with one purpose in mind. When Marty pulled up with Michelle, nothing seemed unusual. He followed her inside, unaware that every step was being watched. Michelle walked ahead of him, leading him exactly where she wanted him to be, her heart pounding not with fear, but with anticipation. Behind them, John moved into position. The shots came suddenly, sharp cracks echoing in the quiet night. Marty didn't even have time to react. The bullets tore through him, his body collapsing near the office entrance. The man who had spent his life in service, who believed in loyalty, lay bleeding on the cold concrete. Michelle, by design, was not the target. She was the survivor, the wife who would later play the role of the shocked widow. But in that moment, she did nothing to stop it, nothing to save him. Instead, she stepped into her role with chilling ease. Within minutes, the Fayetteville police were on scene. To them, at first glance, it looked like a brutal shooting, possibly a robbery gone wrong. Marty was a captain in the Air Force. Attacks like this were rare. Investigators began asking questions immediately. But Michelle had rehearsed her answers. She cried, she acted distraught, and she leaned into the role of the grieving wife. To neighbors and some friends, her tears looked real. But detectives noticed small cracks in her story. Her tone wasn't quite right. Her emotions felt rehearsed, like lines from a play. The investigation moved quickly. Ballistics, witness statements, and evidence at the scene began to paint a picture that didn't match Michelle's version of events. And then there was John Diamond. His connection to Michelle wasn't public knowledge at first, but secrets have a way of unraveling. Phone records, sightings, and whispers around Fayetteville pointed detectives toward the affair. Once John's name entered the investigation, the pieces began to fit. When questioned, John didn't hold up well. The pressure of the crime, the weight of what he had done, and the sharp focus of investigators began to break him down. Soon enough, the truth emerged. John Diamond had been the triggerman, and Michelle had been the mastermind. It hadn't been a robbery. It had been a calculated murder, a plot designed by a wife who no longer wanted her husband, but wanted his removal without consequence. For the Fayetteville community, the revelations were shocking. People who had known the Thiers couldn't reconcile the picture. Marty had been such a devoted man, steady and kind. Michelle had been seen as charming, maybe restless, but few could have imagined she was capable of orchestrating her husband's murder. But the evidence was undeniable. She had manipulated John Diamond, fed him a story of neglect and abuse, and convinced him that killing Marty was an act of love. As investigators closed in, Michelle's mask began to slip. She realized that playing the widow wouldn't save her. Rumors spread of her coldness after the murder, of how quickly she seemed to move past Marty's death. Suspicion grew heavier around her until the day came when police were ready to arrest her. But Michelle had one last move left. She ran. Instead of facing justice, Michelle disappeared. For 3 years, she lived on the run, vanishing into a new life in Florida under an assumed identity. It was a shocking twist in an already twisted story. A woman accused of conspiring in her husband's murder, now living in hiding while his family and friends waited for justice. For Marty's loved ones, it was another betrayal layered on top of the first. Not only had he been taken from them, but the person responsible had escaped accountability. Her disappearance made headlines. The beautiful army wife turned fugitive captured the public's imagination, but beneath the headlines was a man's life that had been brutally ended. Marty wasn't just a victim of murder, he was a victim of trust. He had given his heart, his loyalty, and his future to a woman who saw him as an obstacle. In 2004, Michelle's life on the run finally ended. She was spotted in Florida, living quietly, blending in, but the law eventually caught up. When she was arrested, she tried again to play the role of misunderstood victim. She claimed she hadn't known John would actually kill Marty, that she was caught in something bigger than herself. But the evidence told another story, and prosecutors were ready. Her trial in 2004 was a spectacle. The courtroom filled with people eager to see how this story of love, betrayal, and murder would conclude. Witnesses testified about Michelle's affair, her manipulation, and the chilling precision of the plan. John Diamond's role was clear. He had pulled the trigger. But Michelle's fingerprints were all over the motive, the planning, and the aftermath. She wasn't a bystander. She was the architect. When the jury deliberated, they didn't take long. Michelle Thier was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She had gone from respected officer's wife to fugitive to convicted killer. The transformation was complete. For Marty's family, the conviction was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but nothing could bring him back. They remembered him as a man of loyalty, a man who lived for others, who believed in the promises he made. His life had been stolen by the very person he had trusted most. His story became a cautionary tale, not just about betrayal, but about how love, twisted into obsession, can become deadly. Michelle remains in prison to this day, serving her sentence in North Carolina. John Diamond, too, faced the weight of his actions, living out the consequences of the night he let passion override reason. And Fayetteville, a city that had seen its share of military sacrifice, still remembers the story of Captain Marty Thea, a man who gave everything to duty and love, only to be undone by both. This case isn't just about crime, it's about human weakness, about how desire and manipulation can strip away loyalty, honor, and even life. It's about a man who thought love was enough, and a woman who believed she could have it all by erasing the one person standing in her way. If you've been following the story of Captain Marty Thea, you know how tragic, how shocking, and how deeply human it is. Betrayal, passion, obsession, murder. It had all the makings of a story that still chills people today. And it reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous enemies aren't strangers in the dark. Sometimes they're the ones who share your bed. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories that uncover the